Okay, so here we are with the Addi, and we are going to get ready to cast on the hat. But before we do that, I would like to explain just a couple of elements about the Addi that you should become familiar with. The red area that actually moves around is referred to as the carriage. This piece here is called the hand crank, and you'll notice that this is actually people powered. This is not an electric machine, and so you can control the speed at which the carriage moves. Now, notice that the majority of needles in the carriage are white, but you reach a point where there are 3 black needles. And this is where the action begins. We always start with the 3 black needles positioned directly in front of the shuttle, which is this gold thing here. And the shuttle opens and closes, and that's what the yarn is fed into the carriage from. There is also an automatic row counter, and it is battery operated, so when you first receive your Addi, you will need to insert the battery from the back side here. It's a good idea to clamp it to a table so that it doesn't move around. Notice what a smooth, quiet action the machine actually has. And notice that you can move backwards or forward with the machine. And this switch here is what determines whether you're going to do circular knitting or whether you're going to do flat panel knitting. And because we are going to do circular knitting, we've got the lever in the down position so that we can do that. If we were going to do flat panel knitting, depending on how wide of a panel we wanted, we would start with our black needles, and if we only wanted a panel that was going to be this wide, we could put a stopper here. That was one of those pieces of equipment I mentioned came with the machine in the very beginning in that introductory part of the video. You could also make a panel as wide as the machine. And this machine actually comes in 2 sizes. This is the large version of the machine, and it has 44 needles. The smaller version, which was the first version that was actually produced, only has, I believe, 22 needles, and that is great for doing small children's, infants size hats, and also for doing smaller panels. You can also use it for doing smaller tubes. In essence, by using the circular knitting part of the machine, we're going to be creating a tube. And the tube is going to have a raw edge at each end of it. So when we bind on the hat, we will have a raw edge, and when we get all the way through after cranking maybe 100 to 120 rows, we will have a raw edge at the other end that will need to be finished. So let's get busy and show you how to initially cast on the hat. I'm going to be using 2 strands of a 3-ply yarn. Depending on what kind of yarn you want to work with, if you're going to make a heavier hat, a medium weight hat, or a very lightweight hat, you could use a 2-ply, a 3-ply, a 4-ply. I actually have some very heavy 3-ply yarn that was spun at the rate of only 500 yards per pound. And then I have some very, very thin 3-ply yarn that was spun at the rate of 2,500 yards per pound. So you want to experiment with the different kinds of yarns that you might like to work with. I can tell you that the majority of our yarns are spun at the rate of 1,000 yards per pound, and we use a 3-ply yarn. So I'm going to start out with a black and a white, and I'm actually going to put these on the floor, put my cones on the floor. Whoops. And I'm going to match the beginning of the 2 strands of yarn. And I'm going to drop about 18 inches of the yarn into the center of the machine. Now remember, my 3 black needles are right here in front of the shuttle. Now, I am going to have what I call the trailing yarn in my left hand. So we've got the 18 inches has been dropped into the center, and the trailing yarn is in my left hand. I take the yarn and I create a loop on that black needle that is the needle to the right of the 3 black needles. And I drop that needle down into the carriage so that it locks that first stitch into the machine. And then I'm going to weave the yarns back and forth as I crank the machine. So you'll notice that right now the yarn is coming from behind to this black needle, which is fine. And then I'm going to want to weave it in front, behind, front, behind, and I'm going to do that all the way around. So in essence, I'm getting yarn in front of every other needle. Just like that. And I don't like for there to be a lot of tension, so I may pull out some of the yarn. And I remember the first few times I did this, it felt very awkward. But you get a rhythm, you learn how to do it. And once you get back to your first black needle, you open the shuttle and you drop your trailing threads into the shuttle and close it. Okay, so we're back at the beginning, and the first black needle has popped up, and you'll notice that the yarn is coming behind that last white needle and into the shuttle. Now at this point I like to pick up my crochet hook, because this next row is of very critical importance, and you want to make sure that the yarn is caught under each needle without splitting the yarn. So watch what I mean. So there, the first black needle caught the yarn, but now look, see how that needle is tending to split that yarn? I want that to go under there. So I generally just use my crochet hook to make sure that in this first row that my yarn is not being split. The reason I don't want the yarn to be split will actually become apparent when I go to finish that raw edge, because the yarn that was dropped into the center of the machine is going to be used as a gathering yarn, and if there were any split yarns, it would not gather properly. Now notice too, if you look at the stitches, you can see how they are created. And you will have in this first row, for example, you will have a thread that is behind these 2 little black holders, and then in the next one you'll have a thread that's in front. So remember when we were weaving in front and in back, that was your first part of the first row, and now that we're coming back, the thread is actually showing up behind. So that's what's going to create that very first row. Okay, and you'll notice I'm now back to the position where the 3 black needles are in front. And at this point, I like to take that yarn that is in the center of the machine and just make sure that there's a little bit of tension there. And at this point now, I can generally get a much faster speed going. Now with some yarns, it works better to have the yarn coming from the back of the shuttle, and with some yarns, you may actually want the yarn to be fed in from above into the shuttle. You don't really need to have any tension on it. Whoops. That happens occasionally, and it's important to be monitoring the thread as it's being picked up by the needle as it comes out of the shuttle. So we're actually doing our first full row, and I'm not doing it with a lot of speed at this point. Again, I pull out some of the tension from my yarn, and now I can pick up a little bit of speed because it's learning what to do. Now you'll notice I'm using 2 different colors of yarn. And I can actually control which becomes the dominant color on the good side of the hat. What we're looking at here is in essence the inside of the tube, or another way of saying it might be the wrong side of the hat. And I can control which color dominates by which color is actually on the inside of the needle as it's going down. And you might even want to use your fingers to separate the strands so that you can control that more thoroughly. So I'll bet your grandmother never knitted this quickly, did she? And once you're comfortable with the action of the machine, you will learn your own speed based on the yarn that you're using. There are some yarns that I can actually crank 100 to 110 rows in maybe 25 minutes, and other yarns I have to be a little bit more careful and I slow it down, and maybe it takes me 30 to 35 minutes to crank the same number of rows. It's interesting to me how as the yarn is coming off the skein, I oftentimes will pick up pieces of pasture debris that were not eliminated during the milling process of the yarn. And to me, that's just part of the fun of making the hat and knowing that it came from some of my animals. right, at this point I have completed 40 rows of my hat, and I'm going to make this hat with 110 rows. Now, sometimes if the battery gives out on you, your row counter may not complete the total number of things. And in that case, it's possible to just count your rows and know that you've got the right number that you want. So there would be your first row, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seven, eight. And you just actually count the rows until you've got the right number. Now remember, we're looking at the wrong side here. There's the right side of what is actually going to be seen. And look at that. There's a little piece of pasture debris built right into my hat. You can leave it in or take it out. And at this point, I want to show you how to do a color change. On this hat, I've decided that I'm going to do 1/3 of the hat with black and white, and that will be the head part of one side. And then I want to do about 32 to 36 rows of white, and that'll be the brim on both sides. And then I'm going to finish with probably a white and a fawn. So we're going to show you how to do a color change. So I'm coming to the end of my black, and my first black needle is here. So I just snip off the yarn, and I put my second color on the floor. I open the shuttle, and the black yarn that I've snipped off, I simply pull out of the shuttle and I drape it into the center of the hat. And then the beginning of the next color of yarn, I lay in the shuttle and I drape it into the center of the hat at the exact same place where the black yarn is. Now I close my shuttle. And you'll notice that that last black yarn is under your first black needle. And then the rest of it is trailing. So notice also that as the yarn is coming out of the shuttle, the first fawn colored piece is getting picked up by the next needle. And once both of those have been locked into place, you can simply take your two tails and make a square knot. And you see these little red lips, I call them. You want to tie your yarn and anchor it under that red lip. And I usually make 3 rounds of ties. And now I have made my color change. And you may actually find that the new colors have a different tension in the machine, especially if they've been spun a little differently than the first colors you were using. But wasn't that easy to make that color change? And of course you can change colors just as often as you would like. Sometimes I will actually take scrap yarn and make a hat that has as many different colors in it as I have colors of scrap yarn. And I won't even necessarily start my color changes at where the 3 black needles start. I'll just start them wherever I end up running out of that piece of scrap yarn. As long as you lay the 2 tails in the same position, you will be fine. Sometimes as I get down to the end of the cone, it's losing its weight and it wants to fall over. So you have to be sensitive to that as well. Sometimes you'll hear the machine making different sounds as it's picking up the yarn. You know, don't get alarmed. It's working just fine. Most of the time, it's going to be very quiet. And this really is just trying to be a problem here. But that's okay. That's just life. Making your hat. Alright, so I'm changing color for the last time on this hat. I've already snipped off my fawn color and I'm putting in my white. And I should mention that, you know, with alpacas, 80% of the herd is white. And so I like to make sure that I'm using white as one of my strands of color through the whole hat, and using another natural color or another dyed color as the other part, so that I'm really getting maximum benefit for my white yarns and still getting a colored look. You'll notice there's another piece of pasture debris that's getting ready to get knitted into the hat. So here I'm just making my square knot again. There's one. If for those of you that don't know what a square knot is, that's left over right and right over left. And now I'm on my last 37 rows for this hat. And again, it's going to feel just a little bit differently than the feel of the fawn and white or the black and white. Okay, we're coming around the carriage on our last row, and there's my first black needle jumping up. So we're getting to the point now where we're going to bind off, and that is going to be the subject of our next video. So stay tuned.